Prohibition reflected the mood and extremes of the 1920s. Passed in 1919, the 18th Amendment of the Constitution banned the manufacture, distribution, and sale of alcoholic beverages. This amendment and prohibition went into effect on January 16, 1920. Two factors that led to prohibition were a century-long temperance movement and World War I. The temperance movement encompassed a variety of people who shared the belief that the consumption of alcohol should be prohibited.
I solemnly promise, God helping me, to abstain from the use of all distilled, fermented, and malt liquors, and that means wine and beer. I don't drink, and I will do all I can to keep you from drinking.
Participants tended to be religious, middle-class, old-stock Americans. To them, drinking liquor was a sign of a weak character and led directly to many of society's ills: family violence, poverty, and crime. Conservative organizations such as the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League sprouted up in the late 19th century, determined to turn the United States into a dry nation. The newest immigrants, city dwellers, and blue-collar workers became targets of these groups.
Prohibition is once again seeing this reaction against people who are different, because drinking was much more common among cultures other than Protestants, the Catholics, the Jews. It's much more part of their culture. And this coincides with immigration, it coincides with urbanization, industrialization. So Americans kind of stereotypically see then, if they're rural Americans, perceive that these changes are altering their culture, altering the America that they love.
Well, basically, prohibitionism, was a political movement, sort of just saying no. At the same time, many progressives felt that essentially immigrants could not be trusted, or blacks or Native Americans could not be trusted with the consumption of alcohol.
By the early 20th century, various temperance organizations have success in passing prohibition laws at the local level. And by 1917, 26 states created laws forbidding the sale of alcohol. World War I proved a perfect stage for promoting victory through sobriety. Using patriotic rhetoric, the Anti-Saloon League declared that Germany's mightiest ally in the United States was liquor. They claimed that breweries were using enough barley each day to make 11 million loaves of bread for soldiers, and that both beer and pretzels were associated with Germany's evil empire. In contrast, the Anti-Saloon League stood for God, America, and a sober soldier fighting for victory. President Hoover described prohibition as a great social and economic experiment, noble in motive. To the surprise of almost everyone, this experiment, designed to cut down the crime rate and make us a happier, healthier nation, did just the opposite. The underground society that arose from prohibition put the roar in the roaring 20s.
They didn't anticipate. I mean, they thought this would be the end of all the social ills that they had perceived alcohol caused, not realizing that it was perhaps creating new ills, creating disrespect for the law, creating a whole organized crime like Al Capone.
Getting booze became an obsession for many Americans. Bootlegging, the illegal production and distribution of liquor, rose to meet their demands. Bootleggers, named after 17th century smugglers who concealed bottles of liquor in their boots, snuck alcohol into the United States across the Canadian and Mexican borders, from the Caribbean islands, and from ships anchored outside territorial waters.
A frequent place for smuggled liquor is under the hood. In this case, the smuggler had 8 quarts in a sack. Various parts of automobiles are used to smuggle in liquor. In this case, it's a battery capable of holding 6 quarts. Here's a tube that is inflated with air and put inside a real tire. When the air is let out, they have the liquor in the tube. These are frequent methods of smuggling liquor over the borderline. The women are about as bad offenders as the men. This will hold 6 quarts.
The equipment to build a small still, a device to make liquor, was a must-have for many households and affordable at around $6. In fact, a still producing more than 13,000 gallons of whiskey a day was found on the Texas farm of Senator Morris Shepherd. Senator Shepherd was the author of the 18th Amendment. Suppliers were needed to quench this overwhelming demand for alcohol. Thirsty patrons poured into speakeasies to socialize and get their liquid fix. These secret drinking clubs numbered over 100,000 in New York City alone. They often provided their customers with coded membership cards, plush and exotic settings, nightly entertainment, and scotch at $25 a bottle. These clubs stayed open using police payoffs and elaborate alarm systems to warn of ensuing raids by federal agents. Edward VIII, then Prince of Wales, often frequented a speakeasy run by colorful divorcee Texas Guinan. During a police raid, Guinan rushed Edward into the kitchen, placed a chef's hat on his head, a skillet in his hand, and advised him to keep cooking eggs until trouble passed. The police were totally fooled, and Edward escaped the paparazzi, as well as the penitentiary. Creating and supplying bootleg liquor for Americans was a multi-million-dollar business. Organized crime was born out of Prohibition as a way to cash in on this illegal opportunity. With income from speakeasies and bootlegging, these criminals or mobsters bought cars, machine guns, and people. Gangsters rose above the law due to the corruption of politicians and police.
And I think the upshot of the thing was that what Prohibition did was it allowed a group of these urban street gangs, mostly of ethnic backgrounds, and to come together, and it gives them their big meal ticket. And that's where they start to become much more than just these petty street gangs. They become organized gangs and eventually organized crime.
In Chicago, between 1927 and 1931, 227 gang murders took place without a single conviction. The epitome of this lawless violence occurred on February 14th, 1929. 4 members of Al Capone's Chicago gang, dressed as police officers, and cornered 7 rival members of the Bugs Moran gang. The phony police officers shot the men in the back, firing squad style. This bloody event came to be known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Prohibition was unenforceable. 1,500 federal agents had the daunting task of protecting 18,700 miles of coastline and inland borders from smugglers. They had to regulate industries that used alcohol legally to make everything from shaving cream to diesel engines.
For laws to work, I mean, the public has to generally, there has to be a willingness on the part of the public to respect the law. You know, you have to have some kind of mass support. Otherwise, you just really can't make people do something that they're unwilling to do.
Prohibition was one of this decade's numerous examples of the clash between conservative idealists fearful of post-war change and urban industrialists ready to make the transition from rural to urban living. Americans had little idea how far some people would go to retain the old way of life.